Do you know who the youngest person in Hollywood history is to ever win an Oscar? Leaving the entire industry stunned and amazed? A 10-year-old girl, and that girl was Tatum O'Neal. Yet, like a flower that blooms too early only to wither by dusk, that brilliance arrived far too soon. In a family fractured by violence and addiction. It shaped the course of her life almost from the beginning, a path that could not have been more tragic. So what, exactly, did that Oscar prodigy endure? What could drive a child once celebrated by the entire nation into a lifelong spiral of self-destruction? As you follow her story, you'll see the cold shadows hiding behind the glamorous lights. The very lights we often mistake for a dream. And it might make you wonder, is peace, is the ordinary rhythm of everyday life, actually the very gift we so often forget to cherish? If you're ready to face the truth behind that tiny gold statue, keep watching. What comes next may change the way you look at Hollywood and the way you look at the simple things in life. Tatum O'Neal entered the world on November 5, 1963, in a home everyone assumed was a privilege. Her father was the handsome leading man Ryan O'Neal, her mother the actress Joanna Moore. Two names with enough glamour to make any other Hollywood child envious. But in reality, that very home was the first place to shatter Tatum's childhood. Joanna Moore stepped into marriage carrying old wounds no one ever fully understood. After 2 successful appearances on The Andy Griffith Show, she began slipping into hard liquor, tranquilizers, and drugs, the very things 1960s Hollywood treated like a lifestyle booster. The addiction tore away her self-control. Her moods swung wildly, and sometimes she vanished for days without anyone knowing where she'd gone. Ryan O'Neal, celebrated then as the new Prince of American cinema, was a man who ignited easily. His temper, jealousy, and the ego of a rising young star led to constant fights, smashed objects, and moments when he lashed out at the very woman he once adored. In those battles, Tatum and her younger brother Griffin had only one role: to witness. Then, in 1967, when Tatum was barely 3, the marriage officially collapsed. But the divorce freed no one. It only turned Tatum and Griffin into 2 children thrown back and forth, living with their father, then their mother, then dragged into court again because of custody battles and emotions neither parent could confront. People looked at the O'Neals and saw a showbiz family. To the children, it was nothing of the sort. It was a battleground, one without clear sides, only emotional shrapnel they had to endure in silence. If the broken marriage of Ryan O'Neal and Joanna Moore was the first crack, then the 4 years Tatum lived with her mother were the abyss that swallowed her childhood. After the divorce, the court temporarily awarded Tatum and Griffin to Joanna Moore, a decision that seemed compassionate but opened a chapter Tatum would later describe with 2 words: living hell. By then, Joanna was drowning in alcohol, tranquilizers, and stimulants. Her body was skeletal, her eyes sunken, her voice pitched strangely high, symptoms unsettling even to adults, let alone 2 small children. And inside that tiny Los Angeles house, Tatum's world became a distorted version of childhood. The siblings were rarely fed properly. Some days there was no meal at all, just cold scraps or whatever they could find in a fridge that was usually empty. Their clothes were torn, ill-fitting, or non-existent. At times, Joanna disappeared for days, locking the garage door and leaving Tatum and Griffin inside. They grew so hungry they resorted to eating the dog's food to survive, a dark, haunting memory Tatum would never be able to erase. And because no one taught them, no one set rules, the 2 children grew up as if abandoned in the wild. They relieved themselves on the floor. They played with fire as a form of entertainment. They jumped from rooftops to the ground without the slightest awareness that it was dangerous. That period grew even darker with the appearance of the men their mother brought home. Joanna changed boyfriends constantly, and many of them were emotionally abusive, or worse, engaged in behaviors that left Tatum with psychological scars she carried well into adulthood. She later said that as she grew older, there were memories so fragile that touching them, even lightly, felt like her heart was tightening and breaking, all at once. During those 4 years, Tatum had almost no real childhood. No proper schooling, no adult protection, no family meals, no stability at all. And from that foundation, the rest of Tatum's life, addiction, broken marriages, losing custody of her own child, and eventually a near-fatal stroke, was seeded long before she ever understood what was happening to her. In 1970, when Joanna Moore lost custody due to addiction and increasingly erratic behavior, Tatum and Griffin were placed with Ryan O'Neal. In theory, this should have been the turning point toward stability. A bigger house, steady meals, and a famous father who at least had the means to care for his children better than their mother. But for Tatum, the transition felt less like salvation and more like moving from one nightmare to another, brighter on the surface, yet no less dangerous. Ryan O'Neal, despite his looks and career success, lived the exact lifestyle of a 1970s Hollywood playboy. The new house was not just a home, but a gathering place for all-night parties, hard liquor, drugs, beautiful young women coming and going, and celebrations that bled straight into morning. Sometimes Tatum woke up to find adults passed out across the living room. Sometimes she wandered into a party where every moral line had been left outside the door. No one told Tatum what was right, what was frightening, or what children should never be near. She simply stood on the sidelines, watching the chaos of adult life, as if it were some distorted initiation into adulthood, one she had no power to refuse. Ryan's temper was short, his patience thinner, and his eruptions often landed on the children. If the years with her mother were a hell of hunger and abandonment, then the years with her father were another abyss, one of chaos and adult indulgence pulling her in far too early. Two opposite environments, one of absolute lack, the other of excess without order, ended up shaping the same outcome: a child growing up with a warped sense of boundaries, safety, and self. Life in her father's hell sometimes carried a faint light at the end of the tunnel. That light was Paper Moon. Ryan O'Neal brought his daughter along to a meeting with director Peter Bogdanovich, and instantly, Bogdanovich saw something Ryan himself had never acknowledged: a child with eyes far older than her age, a gaze impossible to describe. The role of Addie Loggins, a sharp, cunning girl who seemed to have already seen every dark corner of adulthood, felt as if it had been written for Tatum. But behind those smooth, iconic frames were details that only 1970s Hollywood could produce. A 9-year-old child working like a full-grown adult. In the scene where Addie grumbles in the car, one of the most unforgettable moments, Bogdanovich made Tatum redo it 35 times because he wanted the perfect, authentic irritation. Tatum was never allowed to complain or demand anything. Even when exhaustion washed over her, she simply did what she was told. For a child raised in chaos, being obedient was the only way to survive. The more successful she became, the more tightly her private life was controlled. Ryan O'Neal temporarily sent her to live with Stanley Kubrick's family for almost a year so he could focus on his own work. There, in an innocent moment of childish play, Kubrick's daughter cut off all of Tatum's hair. And so, on that fateful Oscar night, the little girl appeared with a chopped short pixie cut, simply because she had no other choice. To the audience at the time, it looked like a charming, bold style, never knowing it was actually an unfortunate accident. To Tatum, it was living proof that a child without protection couldn't even keep her own hair safe. The night Tatum won the Oscar at age 10, a moment any child would dream of spending wrapped in their parents' arms, unfolded in a very different way. In her memoir, Tatum wrote that she spent that night alone in her hotel room, secretly sipping a few mouthfuls of adult champagne, unsure whether she should feel joy or sadness. The golden statue glowed brightly, yet she felt emptier than ever. To Hollywood, Paper Moon was a cinematic miracle. To Tatum, it was the moment the world recognized her talent, and also the moment she learned a painful truth. Even the greatest success could not teach her what real happiness felt like. If to the world the 10-year-old's Oscar was a miracle, then within the O'Neal family, it became a quiet flame, widening the cracks in an already fragile bond between Tatum and her father. After Paper Moon, the press talked only about the little girl with sad eyes and a shy posture who managed to outact her co-star, her own father. Ryan O'Neal, a man accustomed to the spotlight, suddenly found himself standing in the shadow of his daughter. Tatum later said that her father's smile at the film premiere did not look like the smile of a proud parent. It was confused, tinged with discomfort, as if the praise showered upon his daughter was an insult to his pride. The jealousy was silent, but Tatum felt it every day. Every time the press called her name, the distance between father and daughter stretched a little farther. By her teenage years, Tatum O'Neal spent more time on film sets than at home. After The Bad News Bears, 1976, and International Velvet, 1978, the media began calling her the child star growing up the right way, a bright face Hollywood pinned its hopes on. But while everything looked glamorous on screen, her real life was deeply toxic. She had begun using drugs and alcohol, had been abused multiple times by people close to the family, and had attempted suicide. At just 13, she tried to cut her wrists twice. Amid all the chaos, she still had to watch her father's moods to survive. She feared upsetting him, did everything she could to please him. But Ryan O'Neal grew angry with her often. Looking back, Tatum admitted she turned to drugs simply because she had nowhere else to escape to. On set, she was a star. Once the cameras stopped, she became a lost child inside her own family, and drugs, at that time, became a habit no one noticed. With Paper Moon, Tatum O'Neal didn't just make an impression. She set a record no one believed a child could ever reach. In Hollywood, the name Tatum instantly became synonymous with the word legend, not because of a long, steady career, but because of one blinding moment so bright it overshadowed everything that came after. And that was exactly the problem. When you reach the top as a child, Hollywood waits to see what you will do next. And it waits with expectations so heavy even adults can barely carry them. Tatum went on to star in The Bad News Bears and International Velvet, films that kept her position as one of the top child actors of her era. But no performance could ever recreate the explosion of Paper Moon. Not because Tatum became less talented, but because the world had already fixed her in their minds as Addie Loggins, sharp, stoic, prematurely wise far beyond her years. Tatum was still a gifted actress. The truth was simply that her entire career had been defined too early, so every step forward was measured against the 10-year-old legend she once was. Reaching the peak too soon isn't a gift, it's a warning. For Tatum, it meant having nowhere left to climb, but endless ways to fall. By the 1980s, Tatum O'Neal was no longer the face that studios fought over. Hollywood shifted rapidly, and younger stars appeared non-stop, while Tatum lacked what every adult performer needs: long-term strategy, and a solid team behind her. She entered her 20s without anyone guiding her career, without a powerful manager, and without the network other actors typically benefited from. As her personal life became more turbulent, Tatum appeared less frequently in major projects. The roles she received grew smaller. Guest appearances in TV episodes, supporting parts in low-budget independent films that made little impact. The directors who once praised her brilliance at age 10 now no longer knew where she fit. Because Hollywood always prefers a new face, and Tatum carried too many ghosts of her golden past. Ghosts the industry wasn't eager to confront. Even so, Tatum kept working, kept trying to hold on to her craft. But the spotlight no longer followed her the way it once had. For many years, Hollywood remembered Tatum only as a fading legend, not as an actress entering the true adult stage of her career. Entering the early 2000s, just when many believed Tatum O'Neal had stepped off the showbiz racetrack for good, she returned with a role that forced audiences to see her in a completely different light. In the series Rescue Me, 2004 to 2005, Tatum played a woman battling alcoholism, a character layered, jagged, and painfully complex, so close to her own truth that it was difficult to tell where acting ended and reality began. Critics praised the comeback not for shock value, but because Tatum showed she still possessed the same instinct that stunned Hollywood when she was 10. The ability to recognize the pain inside another human being and project it onto the screen with a rawness that made people uncomfortable. After Rescue Me, Tatum continued appearing in television shows and independent projects. Those roles didn't return her to the ranks of A-list stars, but they revealed something far more important. She had never lost her craft. Life had simply forced her to tuck it away for too long. In the early 2000s, when her acting career had become only a faint shadow of the Paper Moon era, Tatum O'Neal found another way to survive, she wrote. Her memoir, A Paper Life, 2004, wasn't the kind of shock-driven tell-all tabloids love to pin on fallen child stars. The book was more like a surgery of the soul, a place where Tatum peeled off old bandages and faced her life head-on for the first time. She wrote about a childhood of starvation, addiction, abuse, and complete lack of protection. But what stunned readers wasn't the brutality of the memories. It was the way she told them. She wrote with the voice of someone who had endured enough and simply wanted to exhale the truth, even though every sentence seemed to hurt her all over again. The most controversial pages were the ones about Ryan O'Neal. Gone was the image of the charming Hollywood prince of the 1970s. In Tatum's eyes, he appeared as an impulsive man full of unhealed wounds, and in many moments, a rival for the spotlight his own daughter had once taken from him. Ryan lashed back, calling the memoir a vicious pack of lies, and the family fractured even more deeply. But A Paper Life accomplished something Tatum had never managed before. It reclaimed her right to tell her own story. For the first time, she was no longer the child Hollywood picked up and threw away. No longer the silent victim of her past, but a survivor who dared to say out loud what everyone had told her to bury. Even the title, A Paper Life, was a confession in itself. Her whole life had been a sheet of paper where others scribbled their pain, expectations, and lies. The memoir was the first time she held the pen. Middle-aged American readers didn't just see a fallen child star. They saw a woman gathering the shards of herself and piecing them into something she could continue living with. And that, not the scandals, is what allowed the book to outlast all the noise surrounding it. Looking back, Tatum O'Neal's childhood wasn't just lacking care. It was overshadowed by boundaries crossed in ways no child could ever understand, resist, or be protected from. While living with her mother, the adults around her often went too far. experiences she could only describe with two words: not respected. Those shocks left permanent marks on the mind of a little girl who already had no emotional anchor. Later, when she moved in with her father, Tatum hoped life would improve. But the environment of endless parties, intoxicants, and irresponsible adults only pushed her into another kind of trap. In a moment of vulnerability, searching for comfort she had never been taught to seek safely, Tatum placed her trust in the wrong person. And once again, her sense of boundaries was violated. The familiar feeling of having her safety crossed returned, eroding her ability to distinguish what was healthy from what was not. Because she grew up in a world where no one taught her about limits, safety, or even basic self-worth, Tatum stepped into adolescence in a constant state of figuring it out alone. At just 14 years old, during the filming of International Velvet, she entered her first relationship with someone far older. She had no awareness that the age gap and power imbalance were deeply wrong. Later in her memoir, she admitted she lost herself at 14, believing it was simply what people did, never realizing it crossed ethical and emotional boundaries. That wasn't innocence. It was proof of what happens when a child grows up unprotected. They enter adulthood without a compass to tell right from wrong, safety from danger, affection from exploitation. And so, Tatum's youth slipped into a trajectory of self-destruction, one she didn't even recognize was happening. Amid the chaos of her teenage years, there was only one person Tatum O'Neal believed was her one true anchor: Melanie Griffith. Both girls had grown up in dysfunctional Hollywood families, and they understood each other in ways outsiders could never grasp. To Tatum, Melanie wasn't just a friend. She was the only person who felt safe enough for her to share what she didn't dare tell any adult. When Ryan O'Neal traveled to Europe to film A Bridge Too Far, Melanie accompanied Tatum as a companion, a true sister. But once they arrived in Europe, Tatum began to notice something that sent her spiraling. Melanie wasn't there for her. She was there for Ryan, the very man Tatum had always kept at arm's length. The truth hit with the force of a blow no teenage girl, desperate for love and stability, could withstand. The one friend she trusted stepped across the boundary Tatum feared most. A blurred, intimate relationship developing between Melanie and Ryan O'Neal. For a girl already carrying deep trauma around violated boundaries, this wasn't just betrayal. It was the collapse of the last fragile sense of safety she had left. Decades later, Tatum still calls it one of the darkest moments of her entire life. The shock pushed her into thoughts of despair and pulled her deeper into self-destruction through alcohol and drugs, as if she were trying to numb her own heart. Tragically, the blow did not come from an enemy or a stranger. It came from the very person she believed she could trust most. Yet, no matter how painful life becomes, it always keeps moving. Tatum O'Neal continued searching for someone, to anchor her emotionally. She met tennis star John McEnroe at a time when both were desperately trying to find stability within the chaos of their own lives. They were drawn to each other quickly, pulled together by wounds that looked painfully alike. In 1986, they married. Hollywood called it the golden union of film and sports. But behind closed doors, their life followed a path no one dared to say aloud. Fast, volatile, fueled by explosive emotions. McEnroe was famously temperamental. Tatum was still drowning in years of unresolved turmoil. Within 5 years, they had 3 children: Kevin, 1987, Sean, 1988, and Emily, 1991. Tatum loved her children deeply. But love alone couldn't heal a body and mind worn down by years of stress, addiction, and emotional instability. Arguments, volatility, and the clash of 2 powerful egos slowly cracked the foundation of the family they tried to build. By 1994, the marriage ended, but the greatest tragedy had not yet arrived. In 1998, Tatum lost custody of all 3 children, one of the most devastating wounds of her life. Her son, Sean, later recalled that there were days when he and his siblings locked themselves inside their room because they were afraid to face a mother who seemed increasingly out of control. It was the moment that exposed the harshest truth. The wounds Tatum carried from her own childhood had bled into the next generation, exactly what she had always feared most. Her marriage to John McEnroe wasn't just a stormy union. It was a mirror reflecting her entire life. Intense love, deep hurt, and a price far too heavy to bear. In the mid-1990s, when her marriage to John McEnroe was still an unhealed wound, Tatum O'Neal stepped into another relationship like someone reaching for anything to hold on to in the middle of a storm. In 1996, she married John Y.Q. Inglis, known as a close friend and trusted advisor of Michael Jackson. The marriage began quietly and ended just as quietly, dissolving in only 1 year. Its brevity revealed something deeper. Tatum had not yet reached a place of inner stability where she could see relationships clearly. Her longing for real affection pushed her into decisions she wasn't ready for. From an unsafe childhood to chaotic young adulthood, she kept walking forward on exhausted feet, searching for warmth in men who themselves were struggling with their own turmoil. That fleeting second marriage felt like a desperate attempt to cling to a version of stability. But Tatum wasn't ready for it, and life wasn't ready to let her stand firm. Years later, all the chaos of Tatum O'Neal's life resurfaced in her memoir, A Paper Life. She wrote it as an act of liberation, after decades of forced silence. In its pages, she described Ryan O'Neal as a violent, volatile father who frequently abandoned his children and created an environment so toxic that no child could possibly grow up whole. Ryan struck back immediately. He called the book vicious lies written to sell a few copies, denied every accusation, and insisted that Tatum was merely digging up the past to seek sympathy. Instead of healing old wounds, the memoir shattered the already fractured family into even smaller pieces. Her relationships with her brothers were no better. Griffin, who once stood by Tatum and publicly confirmed the existence of domestic violence, eventually cut off contact. He said they simply could not coexist. Each of them carried too many painful memories to ever meet in the middle again. Patrick, the other brother, denied everything, not to protect Tatum, but to protect the version of their father he needed to believe in. And then there was Redmond, the youngest, born long after the others, carrying the most devastating inheritance of all: heavy addiction, mental instability, and a life constantly spiraling out of control. From rehab to jail, from one crisis to another, Redmond became the heartbreaking conclusion to a tragedy passed down through generations. In 2018, he was arrested for a violent armed robbery, a moment when the media once again uttered the name O'Neal, not for fame, but for catastrophe. In 2011, Oprah Winfrey brought Ryan and Tatum together again for the show Ryan and Tatum, The O'Neals. The media called it their last chance to reconcile after years of distance, resentment, and harsh words. On the surface, the project was framed as a healing journey. Father and daughter sitting face to face, finally saying the things they had never dared to say. But reality was far more complicated. Old wounds don't disappear just because cameras are rolling. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of tension, decades of unresolved pain, the kind that simply cannot be performed to fit the narrative of a hopeful TV reunion. After filming, Ryan said openly, "Tatum doesn't like me any more than before. Maybe even less. A short sentence, but enough to show that the distance between them remained untouched. Tatum didn't hide her emotions either. The tears she shed on camera weren't scripted. They came from genuinely not knowing how to deal with a father she loved, feared, and resented all at once. The show never received a second season. There was no heartwarming reunion, no breakthrough moment viewers were waiting for. When the studio lights went dark, they left the stage like two strangers, sharing the same last name, yet no longer knowing where to begin in order to become a family again. And that was the truth the show revealed. Some relationships are too deeply damaged to be repaired by a few conversations in front of a camera. The collapse between Tatum and the O'Neal family left a void no apology could fill. But while the parent-child relationship remained a labyrinth with no exit, Tatum's 3 children grew up with a silent question hanging over them. Will I repeat my mother's life? Each, in their own way, fought not to follow the same broken path. Kevin, the eldest, was the most timid of the 3. He carried both surnames, O'Neal and McEnroe, not with pride, but with the weight of a curse. He feared the press, feared the eyes of strangers, feared becoming just another chapter in a long family history of collapse. Kevin chose literature as his escape. He entered Columbia, earned an MFA, and lived quietly, writing in silence. Then came 2014, the day that shaped his life. That morning, Kevin was arrested in East Village for buying what he believed was cocaine, which turned out to be nothing more than baking soda. That evening, he received news that he had secured the publishing deal for his debut novel. Humiliation and hope collided within hours. He feared the arrest would cost him the contract, but the publisher stood by him. That act of faith pushed Kevin to change. After completing rehab, he released Our Town in 2016, a novel based on the life of his grandmother, Joanna Moore. In it, Kevin described the family curse as the instinct to self-destruct whenever success was within reach, because they felt unworthy of it. A description as painfully accurate as it was honest. His relationship with his parents slowly softened. Kevin often spoke of his mother with a rare gentleness. She didn't know how to be a mother, but she never stopped trying. In 2025, Kevin married Fern Coyne in Napa Valley. What moved people most was not the picture-perfect ceremony, but the moment Tatum and John McEnroe appeared together without bitterness in their eyes. Kevin invited his mother to give a speech, a quiet, powerful declaration that he had forgiven her. Sean, the second child, was the most sensitive. From a young age, he chose silence over arguments, a camera lens over confrontation. Photography and visual art became the place where he stored everything he couldn't say out loud. He traveled to Nepal, photographed to raise funds for COVID relief, lived quietly, and stayed mostly offline. But beneath that calm exterior was a storm he hid for years. In a moment of collapse, he smashed objects, sank to the floor, and cried like an abandoned child. He said everything came from what the family passed down. Then Neve appeared, an Irish accountant, so gentle she seemed like someone who didn't belong in Hollywood at all. She didn't run when Sean broke down. She cleaned the room, repotted the plants, and held him until his breathing steadied. They married secretly in Sedona in 2020. Later came a miscarriage, a painful loss, but also a thread that pulled them closer together. Sean became the glue of the O'Neal family. In 2020, he posted a rare photo. The entire family, Ryan, Tatum, and the children, standing together for the first time in nearly 17 years. Ryan and Tatum finally reached reconciliation before he died in 2023. That same year, Sean welcomed his first daughter into the world. Tatum became a grandmother, a new cycle of life, far gentler than the ones before. Emily, the youngest and the only girl, grew up mostly with her father and two brothers. But in her heart, her mother remained a guiding light, distant yet luminous. Emily once joked she needed to win an Oscar before age 11, a self-inflicted pressure only children born into famous families would understand. As an adult, Emily chose acting, but she wanted to be known as Emily McEnroe, not Tatum O'Neal's daughter. In 2024, she appeared in Futra Days, an independent film alongside Rosanna Arquette. She also did voice work for Netflix projects, including serving as Scarlett Johansson's voice double in A Ghost in the Shell-related production. Emily starred in the short comedy Hi Mom, openly poking fun at her own family, a choice that showed she wasn't running from her past, but refusing to let it control her. She now lives in California with her boyfriend, musician Timothy. She frequently posts photos with her mother and brothers, a clear sign that this family, somehow, has found a gentler rhythm. In 2023, Emily joined the SAG-AFTRA strike, standing with actors and writers, proof that she wants to build her own voice, not hide under her mother's shadow. After a storm-filled artistic journey, Tatum O'Neal's legacy is not contained in the golden statue she held at age 10. It lives in what that statue hid: a prodigious talent thrown into life too early, and a woman who spent her entire adulthood trying to reclaim herself after Hollywood demanded too much from her too soon. More than half a century has passed, yet the record of the youngest person ever to win an Oscar remains untouched, a stone no one else has been able to move. Her portrayal of Addie Loggins in Paper Moon became a textbook example of child acting, minimalistic, authentic, and prematurely wise in a way no one has been able to replicate. But perhaps more meaningful than that was her return in Rescue Me. Just as Hollywood was beginning to forget her name, she reappeared in the role of an alcoholic woman, transforming her own years of mistakes into dramatic material. As an adult, she no longer performed with technique alone. She performed with lived experience, and that gave her character the weight of truth. When Tatum released A Paper Life, the public stopped seeing her as a fallen child star. They saw a woman choosing to say out loud what many spend a lifetime burying: domestic violence, control, fear, shame, addiction, and inherited trauma. Tatum never excused her own actions. She simply told the truth. And that honesty helped many realize they were not alone in growing up inside toxic households. For anyone struggling with addiction, with feelings of unworthiness, or with the fear of repeating a parent's mistakes, Tatum became a symbol of survival, not perfect, but persistent. She may not have found healing for herself for many decades, but her 3 children carried that healing further. And perhaps that is Tatum O'Neal's real legacy: pain deep enough for the next generation to understand, clarity strong enough for them not to repeat it. The Oscar may be a milestone for Hollywood, but her 3 children, living with awareness, boundaries, and healthy love, are the true milestone of Tatum's life. In 2020, while the world was shrinking into the storm of COVID-19, Tatum O'Neal entered a storm of her own, one far more violent. After decades of battling physical pain, depression, and emotional wounds that had never healed, her body finally reached its limit. A combination of painkillers, arthritis medications, opiates, and morphine, all legally prescribed, caused her to collapse in her Century City apartment. When she was rushed to the hospital, she fell into a deep coma. Her heart stopped. Her body convulsed. Every prognosis was bleak. Doctors told the family they might lose her, and even if she survived, frontal lobe damage could leave her unable to speak, walk, or even see or hear the way she once had. For 6 weeks, Tatum lay motionless in the ICU, completely cut off from the world. The room was cold and bright, machines beeped steadily, and the body of a woman who once stood before millions remained utterly still. When she woke, Tatum O'Neal didn't recognize where she was. She couldn't speak, couldn't form thoughts, and was swallowed by terror inside her own body. That loneliness was made even crueler by the fact that on the other side of the door, her children were there, but couldn't enter. During the pandemic, all they could do was press their palms to the hospital glass, make video calls, and try to send warmth through tiny screens. It was an isolation no mother deserves, especially not someone who had already lived through so much loneliness. Her recovery took 3 years and nearly started from zero. Tatum had to relearn how to speak, how to read, how to write, even how to piece her memories together so they wouldn't slip away. Alongside physical rehabilitation, she continued therapy, joined support groups, and tried to build a life no longer dependent on the things that had dragged her down for decades. For the first time in her life, she was forced to slow down, and for the first time, she saw her own fragility clearly. The biggest difference in this chapter was the family. The 3 children who once grew up in chaos became the anchors for the mother they feared might never return. Kevin, calm, grounded, stayed by her side throughout treatment. And when he married in 2025, he invited her to give a speech at the wedding, a quiet acknowledgement that her place in his life had finally come home. Sean, the deeply emotional one, became the glue that held the entire family together, even helping Tatum and Ryan reconcile one last time before Ryan passed in 2023. Emily, radiant and young, continued to build her acting career and appeared with her mother on social media, creating an image of a Tatum who was no longer as alone as before. Today, Tatum lives quietly, no longer chasing the spotlight Hollywood had thrust upon her too early. She devotes her days to physical therapy sessions, and staying close to her family. Her body still carries damage, her memory still fractures at times, her speech remains difficult. But in her eyes, slow, sometimes cloudy, there is a clarity that was rarely seen before. The clarity of someone who has stood at the edge of life and stepped back from it. It is a resurrection, fragile, but deeply worthy of respect. Because to reach this late peace, Tatum had to sacrifice almost everything: her youth, her health, her years as a mother, a daughter, and even pieces of her memory. But at least, for the first time in her life, she is living slowly, consciously, and surrounded by people who love her for real. Looking back at Tatum O'Neal's life, the haunting part is not the golden statue she held at age 10. It is everything that happened after. A child thrust into the spotlight before she knew who she was. A young girl lost because no one taught her what love looked like. A mother who dropped too many years to old wounds. And a grown woman who had to relearn life step by step just to reclaim what was hers. And yet, the quietest, most beautiful truth is this: she is still here, resurrected, as if by a miracle. Everything came late, but that doesn't make the journey any less meaningful. It only makes her existence that much more precious. Tatum's story reminds us that fame can hide everything. And it also reminds us that sometimes the most valuable thing is not the peak we once reached, but the simple fact that we still find a reason to rise again, to forgive others, and to forgive ourselves. If you've ever survived a difficult chapter, ever had to change yourself at an age when change felt impossible, or ever learned to forgive your own mistakes, you will understand this story better than anyone. And perhaps Tatum O'Neal's journey will help you see your own life with a new kind of gratitude, that sometimes peace itself is a victory. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any emotional stories about the Hollywood legends you love.